You know, man, I often wonder why it is I'm here, why it is I'm doing these things, why it is I keep making these videos, why it is I have all these ambitions, many of them retarded. And the central conceit that I continue coming back to tends to be that, specifically, and I not do this with one hand, come on. That the aesthetic tends to be paramount. That regardless, I'm going to care about the aesthetic the most in anything that I'm doing. So I tend to think about, well, what lifestyle is aesthetic? Which one makes the most sense in a storybook context, you know? So, when it comes to that, I think, well, I want to learn Vietnamese and so on and so forth. Because at least when I know that, I can take this kind of worldview that those other people have, their aesthetic, and I can use it as my own. I can use it as my own advantage. I can take a bit of their culture, and it enriches my own identity by knowing that a part of their culture is now a part of me. Granted, in a disconnected form, but regardless, it's something that I can connect with and that, becomes part of me by knowing them. That it becomes part of me to understand a certain way that they're thinking. And that's part of why I really love language learning. Like, even though I'm not terribly consistent at it and I tend to go all over the place, I will still find myself spending 4 hours a day just reading text in another language and then looking up words in it. There's lots of Russian words and so on and so forth that I remember, despite not actively studying Russian, because the heart was what mattered. The heart of the language, the heart of the matter, the heart of the fact that I'm doing it, And, I consider myself a purveyor of the heart. I'm not necessarily a purveyor of logic, knowledge, or doing things in a structural manner. I am a purveyor of the heart. And, when you look at me, it kind of makes sense. So, I do these things because it's enjoyable to me. Because when I do them, I feel more happy. When I do them, there's a sense of purpose, identity, and so on that I get from doing them. That by looking at myself, I feel that I'm more well-rounded and interesting by the fact that I, had done those things. That emotionally, the image of who I am, the story, the narrative that I continue thinking about in my head of who is Infinite Outlaw, it tends to reflect more positively in an emotional manner when I do the things that I do. And so, like, when it comes down to these things, why I want to learn a language and so on versus why I don't want to learn programming, the reason why is because one reflects well on my emotional health, one makes me feel good to do, makes me feel good to think about, Whereas the other I find entirely rote and boring. Nothing that really like the aesthetic of being a programmer, right? That I find that aesthetic very interesting and cool. I'm gonna put this pipe down. I find that aesthetic very interesting and cool, but I only really care about designing websites. Like, I think HTML and stuff like that is pretty fun, pretty cool. But I don't particularly care about like game design and things like that. Something like, you know, uh, Alex Horatio, who's been on a number of podcasts with me, would care about. He tends to be interested in it because he's just obsessed with like the structural math element. I don't give a fuck about any of that. Um, I think there's too many various complicated elements. HTML is cool because I can make a NeoCities account, and I can fucking, sit there and try and conjure up some kind of 90s looking website and everything. That's where it becomes fun, is when you can make something that looks like it literally came out of the 90s. So the extent of my knowledge of HTML is always going to be, how can I make a website look like it's from the 90s? And then from then on, I just don't give a fuck. It's personal interest. It's emotional interest. Why the fuck have I been on this channel for so long? Why have I continued doing this? Because on an aesthetic level, something I can identify with. It's something I feel good knowing that it's a part of me. And sometimes I question whether or not it's one of the only things I truly enjoy. So this kind of projecting an identity, making yourself, your image, your internal image, the way you feel about yourself, making sure that that picture is all clear and you can kind of see that wow, I've done all of these things and it feels so good to know that's me. But at the same time, you enjoy doing those things as well. And that kind of is part of the identity. I think about this a lot. I think about, like, why is it that I continue doing these things, if not for legacy, which I do firmly believe that, I don't use the term legacy directly, but I believe that we should die with honor, and that when we die, we should remember back on all the positive things we've done for other people's lives and all the accomplishments we've made and that shit. Obviously, I need to be catching up on doing that better, because at this point, I've quite negatively affected quite a few people's lives. That's what I'm trying to reverse with each new person that I meet. I want to make sure that I have a positive impact, make sure that people remember me positive, things like that. Know that I've made other people's lives better is what I want to do. And so when it comes to trying to remember, trying to remember back to the life that you've had, a lot of it just comes down to wanting to be satisfied when you die. It's not about what happens after death, because what happens after death is irrelevant. It's black. Your consciousness is gone, your senses are gone. So why does it matter what happens to you after you're dead? What happens to your legacy after you're dead? What matters instead is, in the moment, you want to be able to feel comforted, to know that you were a cool guy, and to know that, yeah, maybe kinda you would have an effect after you're dead, but that part shouldn't really concern you as much, I don't think. So I always think about this Yugoslav girl. She died when she was 17, in when the Nazis were killing a bunch of people over there, and she was a communist, and she was in this group, this rebel communist faction, And I can't remember the exact quote, but she said something like, basically, for her life, she could give up the names of the organizational structure within the rebel movement, or she could die, and she chose to die. Um, Something she told the Nazis was like, "My comrades will." Um, I don't know. It was like they'll honor my name when they kill you, or something like that. I can't remember the exact quote. It sounded way cooler than what I just said, but like they basically she said, "My name and who I am will live on after I've died," which at 17, that's a really ballsy thing to do. You're literally giving up your life for your own people, for the freedom of your own people from this oppressive imperialist power. And hey, the communists did eventually win in Yugoslavia. And I mean, I don't like Tito particularly much because I think he was a revisionist and a capitalist and so on. But the movement certainly did give the people freedom from all these other powers. I mean, even freedom from the USSR. They fucking got out of the Eastern Bloc. But so like, yeah, what I'm talking about is um where was I? Okay. Oh yeah. What I'm talking about is, seeing someone like that who, this year I'll be 17, just like she was when she died. And she had a compact legacy right in front of her that she could be satisfied about when she left the world. I think that's really admirable. Um, and I was reading this book right here, Women by Charles Bukowski. And Bukowski's life is really interesting to me because he died when he was 69, 65? I think it was 69. Either way, in his late to mid 60s. And people just a few years ago they released his on writing book, which was just a collection of letters that he sent to a bunch of different people. Um, and that was information that was still being recovered. People still cared enough about Bukowski to release his work after he had died. And after he had died, he would have no perception of that. He wouldn't care. But I have a feeling he knew when he left this earth that because of the influence of his work and because of the popularity of his work, especially in Europe, um, something like that was probably going to happen. And I don't know how he felt, obviously, but if I were in that position, I would be pretty happy, to be honest. Because the fact that my work would still be having influence, even still new releases after I've died, that'd be pretty cool. Um, and whenever I read an author that's dead like that, like I read, see, The Stranger, The Stranger by Camus. And when I read that, like, the fact, because the story is about death as well, so it kind of plays into the overall narrative, but like, the fact that I'm reading someone that's dead tends to make me think about uh, where exactly, how exactly they would feel about the world now, or how they would feel about how their work is being perceived in the now. And I think a lot about that. I think a lot about, when I'm dying, what am I going to think? And when these authors are dead, what would they think of now? Mm, I think it's pretty cool. I think it's pretty cool to have thoughts like that. For a long time, I didn't want to think about it, out of sight, out of mind. But I think it's important to kind of hone your legacy and appreciate that legacy for what it is. Epicurus said to live the simple life. Well, I think you should live as simply as possible while simultaneously, um, fostering a kind of legacy that people can remember you by. Um, and you know, it's healthy. It's healthy to have a goal like that. Maybe not healthy to be super image obsessed and think about what your aesthetic is so much. Um, and I do think a lot about that. That's how I am. It's part of my personality. I think about, like, on an aesthetic level, is my lifestyle and is what I am aesthetic? You know, that's just how I think. That's how I perceive the world. But the responsibility dawns upon me when I have to realize that if you think too much about that, if you exude an aesthetic in a very, like, overabundant type of way, then it can have very real negative effects on you. You know, it can fuck things up. So you have to not be self-absorbed, but you can still do things because they feel good emotionally. That's the core of why I'm making this video, and that's the core of why you should do stuff that makes you happy. Or if something doesn't make you happy, find a way to do it in a way that makes you happy. I don't think there's any point in toiling away at computer programming if you don't like computer programming fundamentally. I tried it so many times back in the day, I did not like it. But what I do like, memorizing words, reading in other languages, and then looking up the words and shit, or learning alphabets, stuff like that. It's really fun to me. And if it's not fun, if it's something that's just like, why am I doing this right now? Those things I tend to get over with time, like repetition, a lot of repeated listening to phrases, which I don't tend to do that. That's like vocabulary memorization. That's fucking retarded. Because the vocabulary memorization, the problem with it is that, like, when you sit there and you try to think about, I'm going to know these strings of words, I'm going to know these phrases, well, that's really just putting it in your short-term memory. The way you get stuff in your long-term memory is by immersing yourself into it. You sit down and you say, I'm going to read Stalker today, or, I don't know, other Russian books, Dostoevsky, someone like that. I'm gonna read. I don't remember what he wrote. That's the funny thing. So you read some Russian author, right? And you read it in Cyrillic. And so you, the big brain boy that you are, understand Cyrillic. You've taught yourself the alphabet. You know the je, ikrate, and so on and so forth. And so, like, well, you know both sh's, you know, sh and sh, or whatever. They look almost exactly the same, and they sound almost exactly the same. You know all the weird caveats in the Cyrillic alphabets. So you come to read this book, and you're trying to sound out each word on your own. You're trying to understand each word by looking it up in the dictionary, by as well listening to the audiobook after you've guessed what that word is, because this is always fun for me. When I know an alphabet, I can sit there and I can think about, okay, well, knowing these sounds, how would these sounds be put together? And but more than often, you're usually right about how it's put together, at least 75% right. And then you miss a few caveats within the pronunciation, and then that's where the audio recording corrects you. And I think that's really useful. It's really useful to have that constant immersion, listening and reading in content that you care a lot about, because that's how we retain memory. We retain memory by having fun, and that's not like a weird, oh, I'm an aesthetic lifestyle guy thing, which I am, but it's also just about how humans work. Now, some people, they're willing to memorize, and study grammar. Well, that's how we're taught in school, and that's how a lot of people tend to want to approach it. And, they take 5, 6, 7 years to learn a language. They eventually know the language, but I find that to be incredibly inefficient, because the science shows the people learning these languages show that immersion and listening and reading from content that you enjoy constantly tends to be far more effective than, sitting down and doing this kind of memorization. It's only in your short term. And you have to talk with people too. Like, if you're not talking with people, how can you test your abilities and further make connections? Because the way human beings make connections is via emotional response. It's about the story to it. Why did you learn so many of the words that you did when you were a child? It's because you heard them and then you saw an action or contextual situation that you could then identify that word to. So someone says, "Dad, I am Dad," and so on, and you know who Dad is. And the exact same thing works with grammar. And, these kind of structural words that don't have much of a meaning in themselves, but more are meant to connect to other words. And you can make a story for those too. You can remember what those words are. I will never forget Privyet Travaish, because when I say that, it means hello, comrade, by the way. When I think of that, I think of communism, and I think of how beautiful Russian pronunciation is, and I think of my emotional connection to both of those things. So if Russian folks come up to me, I'm, kind of as a joke, I'd be like, "Privyet, travaish," or "Zistruche." Did I say that right? Zistruche, or is it Zastruche? Zastru, it's something like that. Either way, see, again, I'm not the best at pronunciation. Pronouncing stuff, So if I'm, trying to say something like that, as a way to greet somebody, I'm always going to remember that because I have a story associated with that. And each word really does have its own, understand that. And so yeah, what I'm saying is do stuff because it's fun, do stuff because it makes you happy, and concern yourself about legacy, but don't be too sad about death, because death is an integral part of life and stuff. This video went on way longer than I thought it would. And the funny thing is, I've only recorded this for myself. It's probably going to go on one of those secret channels that I have or whatever, just for the sake of archival. So, yeah. YouTube. It's a nightmare.